there's a difference between the way that we measure corruption when we're doing economic research and what you would do if you were trying to prove a case in court. Okay, so if you took this evidence to court and said, I think I'm going to try to convict one of these like school teachers or someone in the central government for corruption, A, we wouldn't know who was responsible, so that would be a real problem for a court case. And B, they could spin all kinds of stories about bad accounting and we're so sorry and we fixed the mistake, and it's not kind of the caught red-handed, with my hands in the whatever fingers in the cookie jar that you might need to actually convict someone. And so, but that's actually a common theme, that for economics research we might not need the same burden of proof that we need for a court of law. And so you'll see actually that sometimes we might be okay with a little bit with some parts that we don't fully understand, because then we're going to do some intervention and sort of see if this number goes up or down, and we'll say, well, gee, even if we didn't get that number exactly right, at least we can say something kind of meaningful about what our intervention did. And I'll say more about that in a little bit next lecture. Okay, but anyway, these numbers are pretty shockingly large. So here's another example. Have any of you heard of the UN Oil for Food program? No. Okay. So this is dating me a bit. So Saddam Hussein, remember him? In the 1990s, is it 90s? Am I right? Yes. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Saddam Hussein, up until I guess in between the two Gulf Wars, Saddam Hussein the government of Iraq under Saddam Hussein was allowed to sell oil in the private market to pay for food. Okay, and what they did, what has been alleged that they did, was that the government didn't just use the money for food. It wanted to get kickbacks from this process to use it to buy other things that the government wanted more, like say weapons or something. And so the way they did this was they underpriced Iraqi oil in exchange for a kickback. So if the market price is 100 and they should have sold it at 100 and gotten $100 a barrel for food, they would sell it at, hypothetical numbers here, 90, right? And there would be $10 of difference, and they would get $5 paid into a secret bank account, right, as a kickback, and another $5 would be the profits for the middleman that took all these risks of sort of doing this illegal activity. Okay? So this was a big scandal, actually. There was actually a big UN investigation into this whole thing. But what these economists are trying to do is sort of say, well, look, can we actually detect this by looking at the gaps in oil prices between Saudi oil, which is kind of like traded on the free market, and Iraqi oil, which was very similar, but sort of was essentially had this underpricing thing. And so they show you these graphs. This is basically the period. This is the key. So this is the difference between the two different types of oil, right? This is like price of Saudi oil minus price of Iraqi oil. This is not during the oil for food program. This is during the oil for food program, right? All of a sudden, like the Iraqi oil becomes much cheaper than the Saudi oil, and then they make some changes over here, and boom, it goes right back down again, right? And they say, well, look, we can try to estimate how much money that was through all the underpricing by basically, but it's a similar idea, right? Comparing the difference between two things, right? One that has no corruption, one that has corruption, and they get a number like $3.5 billion if you sort of add up the difference between these curves and multiply by the quantity, you get something like this area over here is like $3.5 billion. So that's a lot of money. But it's only about 6% of the total value of the oil sold. So in my example before, if it was $100, they were selling it for 94 or something like that. So one reason it's, I think, kind of interesting to put this up right after the last slide is, right, this was a lot of money, but as a percentage, it was actually pretty small compared to the total value of the oil. Nevertheless, it was a huge amount of money. And they sort of guess, based on sort of the other things about the industry, that maybe a third of this went to the Iraqis. One other thing that's kind of interesting, compared to the point that I was making before about kind of the caught red-handed evidence, which is if you compare the number that the economists get of sort of the total underpricing to what the UN investigation actually could sort of prove was done in kickbacks, these numbers are substantially larger than what they could prove. Right, and that's sort of saying, again, we might, the burden of proof you need in sort of a legal document is different than what we would, our best guess that we might get from an economic perspective.